It is widely believed that Australia remained isolated from the outside world until the British came in 1788. However, just decades before this, there were seasonal visitors who came to the northern Australian coast to harvest sea cucumbers, a highly valued delicacy in Chinese markets. These were the Makassans, a maritime people originating from the island of Sulawesi in modern-day Indonesia. In this video, we will explore a timeline where this activity would lead to the colonization of Australia by Indonesian predecessor states. Firstly, let's address why, historically, Australia wasn't given much attention in the Malay world. Aside from sea cucumbers, the coast offered nothing of real value. It was far too barren and hospitable and far away to be even considered relevant by the polities of the region. Furthermore, sea cucumbers were also available elsewhere in Southeast Asia, making trips to Northern Australia not really a necessity. So, how do we make Northern Australia more appealing? The simple solution: scarcity. Let's just say that they got very unlucky, and a few devastating outbreaks would wipe out most of the sea cucumber population in Southeast Asia, leaving Northern Australia as the only reliable source in the region. This would create a sort of gold rush effect, as Makassans would rush to the Northern Australian coast to harvest sea cucumbers. Even so, the Makassans themselves would have no reason to remain year-round once the harvesting season was over. What this would have done, however, is offer a monopoly over the sea cucumber trade, therefore making it attractive to a particular Indonesian polity, Tidore. At the time, Tidore was one of the few Indonesian states that remained a significant maritime power, so if any Indonesian polity would capitalize on this, it would be Tidore. Fortunately for us, Tidore did actually practice colonialism in Papua, so it have a good idea of how they might colonize Australia. The Tidore's colonization doctrine relied on vassalizing locals, converting them to Islam, and extracting tribute. Therefore, we would likely see something similar here, except instead of Papuan villages, it would be the Aboriginals, such as the Yolngu and Tiwi. Unfortunately for Tidore, this would most likely not change the fact that they'd be vassalized by the Dutch in 1780, which would lead to Northern Australia effectively falling into the Dutch sphere. This brings us to the British occupation of Dutch colonies during the Napoleonic Wars. The Dutch colonial empire was essentially at Britain's mercy, with Britain deciding what to return and what to keep. In our timeline, the British returned the Dutch East Indies, and in this timeline, that would likely include Northern Australia. From the British point of view, this would be a barren land, with a sparse native population within the Dutch sphere. They'd have nothing to gain from seizing it, and it would probably just destabilize the East Indies by alienating Tidore's nobles, not something that Britain would want given its agenda for stability. In fact, they may have even partitioned the continent with the Dutch as a sort of compensation for taking South Africa. As a Dutch colony, it would lack the attention and investment that the British and New South Wales gave it in our timeline that would eventually lead to the discovery of oil and precious metals. Therefore, it would be quite economically unimportant. In this timeline, Northern Australia wouldn't be valuable due to its resources, but rather its geographical position. Historically, Indonesia in its early days was a highly irredentist nation. Its leader, Sukarno, was extremely salty about not gaining West Papua upon full independence during the Round Table Conference in 1949. He rapidly militarized in order to prepare for an invasion, with the military receiving 85 Soviet warships and over 200 aircraft, with 24 of which being strategic bombers, which made Indonesia the only nation in Asia with strategic bombing capability other than the US, USSR, and UK. This led to Operation Trikora in 1961, where the Indonesians attempted to seize Papua by force. The US, not wanting the Indonesians to drift towards the communist bloc, pressured the Dutch to leave, eventually leading to Indonesia annexing it. With Northern Australia as a former part of the Dutch East Indies, it would almost be certain that Sukarno would claim it too. This would concern the Australians, who, in our timeline, initially supported Dutch Papua as a buffer between itself and a potentially unstable Indonesia, only backing down during the Trikora operation when the US backed Indonesia. A communist-aligned country encroaching on its continent would likely be unacceptable to the Australians, who would, in this alternate timeline, be firmly on the Dutch side. Historically, there were discussions about vague ideas of a Melanesian federation, which would consist of both Dutch and Australian Papua. This was heavily supported by the Papuan elites at the time, so it's conceivable that, in this timeline, they'd take this proposal seriously and establish the Federation. This would have theoretically made it harder for Jakarta to push its anti-colonialist rhetoric, as it would be hard to position themselves as a liberator of an already decolonized state. With this arrangement, the Pacific seems ripe for a proxy war of significant proportions, with Indonesia backed by the Soviets on one side and the Dutch and Australians on the other. The outcome of this conflict would hinge on the decision of the United States. Would they still back Indonesia in order to appease them, or would they take their allies seriously and recognize that Jakarta has crossed a red line? Some may argue that the US wouldn't want to risk Australia's security just to appease Indonesia, but for the sake of it, let's imagine they do anyway. Australia and the Netherlands are told to yield or have their economic aid withdrawn. Theoretically, this would put most of Australia within Indonesian bombing range, which would make the Australians understandably paranoid. The Menzies administration at the time was already highly anti-communist, so this could easily amplify their sentiment. Imagine an Australian Red Scare in the 60s focused on the threat of a potential Indonesian strike. Australia, in this timeline, would likely enter an arms race with Indonesia after 1961, trying to match their state-of-the-art Soviet hardware. Perhaps they also pour copious amounts of resources into supplying Sukarno's opposition. They may even consider developing a nuclear program. However, this would probably be short-lived. Sukarno was bound to fall. By the mid-60s, Indonesia's economy had already collapsed, leading to the 1965 military coup. The new order was explicitly uninterested in Sukarno's ambitions and was tolerated by the West, especially since there weren't any better alternatives. Altering this would require a complete rewrite of Sukarno's policies, which is a whole other topic. Australian hysteria would likely dissipate within a few years, leaving the scenario little more than a historical footnote. That's all for this video. If you liked it, consider subscribing and leaving a suggestion in the comments below. Thanks for watching.